Well, I'm a big fan of all these guys right here to my left. I'd like to introduce them. We start off with cinematographer of Late Night, Matt Clark. Next to him is a senior colorist for Light Iron who worked on Late Night with Matthew, Sean Dunckley. Next to him, we have senior vice president of optical engineering at Panavision, Daniel Sasaki. And finally, the cinematographer of Can You Ever Forgive Me, Brandon Trost. So, Brandon, I guess I want to start by asking, what on this movie were your initial conversations with the director like in terms of the tone you were trying to achieve? And then why did you choose the camera system and workflow you chose and large format and all of that to sort of get across the ideas you were trying to convey about these characters?
Forgive me, it's been a couple of years since we shot the movie. But, the movie it's the second time I'd worked with the director, Mari Heller. We had done a smaller movie together called The Diary of a Teenage Girl that was also sort of like a smaller kind of intimate portrait of about a couple of characters. And this was sort of leaning into that same idea, I guess. We just wanted it to really feel like it was about these two troubled people who find each other and through a sense of, I guess, criminal activity, sort of figure out, a little bit of a life lesson. But it's, we wanted it to feel like just like a portrait of this time and space in a way. The movie takes place in 1991, and we didn't have the biggest budget in the world, and there was a lot of challenges to try to create that New York that doesn't really exist anymore. New York now is so clean and nice. It's like Disneyland compared to what it was in like the late 80s. So it's we were trying to find different ways to really show the location and the feel, but it was also a movie that takes place in the winter. I guess I'm sort of spilling out a bunch of different things that we were trying to like throw into the mix to figure out what the style of the movie was, because it wasn't like it really called out for anything terribly specific, but we wanted it to have this sort of warm, wintered interior, cooler exterior sort of feeling. We wanted it to have like an old like 70s almost Woody Allen vibe in a way. It was like a lot of different, there's like some Hal Ashby aspects. I mean, we were sort of just throwing a lot of stuff into it, and we kind of wanted the movie to sort of speak for itself in a way. That's kind of a non-answer, but that's sort of like how we found the style for this movie. And our intention was to shoot it anamorphic, actually. We had shot our first movie together anamorphically, and I had already lined up like a set of B-series lenses or something to shoot the movie with, and we were like set to go. And then we were in New York prepping the movie, and they had come by with the DXL, which I was familiar with because I had tested the DXL, I think, a few months prior. I think like one of the first demos they put together, the DXL, I was invited to be a part of and shot the camera, so I had a little bit of experience with it. And they were running through those demos again while I was prepping the camera in New York, and we looked at it just to try it because it was there. We're like, well, let's just see what this is all about. And we really responded to these older 65 millimeter lenses the way that it felt, particularly in close-ups, because the movie is it's just so intimate. It's all about these two people like in apartments and bookstores, and it's really just about spending time with these people. And there was something about the way that the large format with the combination of like a shallow depth of field and the way that the sort of just the large format lenses, it feels different on a face. There's something about it that I can't articulate nearly as well as Dan can, but it just feels a little more like a human eye to me, close up to someone's face. And there was something that like removed a little bit of like the distortion you would get with wider lenses up close that you would see otherwise. And it was weird because I had to like talk myself out of shooting anamorphic. We had figured it out. I was like, we're done. We're good. This is the style of the movie. And then the footage came back and we loved it. And it just felt right. So we moved forward with it. We're like, let's just do this. But the thing was, I was responding well to the older, I can't remember there was some older lens, like the System 65.
Yeah, the System 65.
Yeah. So I really love these older lenses. I'm like, that's it. That's the look. And they're like, they're not available. It's like, oh man. So we had to lean into the Primo 70s, which are like the newer lenses that are developed for this system, which I wasn't opposed to, but I didn't really want this movie to be incredibly hyper sharp. And that was my initial fear, because more resolution, larger sensor, really sharp lenses. I mean, all that stuff sounds like it should be sharper, and in ways it is, and in ways it isn't with this system. But I wanted to figure out how to make this movie feel a little more like it was, I don't know, printed on a piece of matte paper. Like that was kind of like the look that we wanted. We didn't want something to be super resolved, even though we ended up shooting 8K, which is sort of like you would think is the opposite of that, but it sort of isn't. There's a sense of roundness that kind of gave to the resolution in a way. But I really had to strip back the lenses. The lenses were just, for me, they just worked too well. I mean, I like a softer, more sort of analog approach to things, and Dan helped me sort of redesign the lenses in a way to work, I don't know, maybe less efficiently, just differently, I guess differently. So right. I wanted them to be softer ultimately. So we found a cool combination of tricks that I don't even know what they are because Dan did it, but it looked great. And so once we had found that, it was really, by the time we lined up close-ups with these lenses, it just felt like it's just like a really soft, it was like having a specific kind of diffusion on the lens, which I don't always love because I feel like you can feel if there's like a kind of a diffusion filter, but it was built into the glass optically. And then I guess it's like I found this, I was taking this camera and trying to re-engineer. It was brand new too. It was the first time anyone had ever, I think, shot on this with this system. So it was sort of a risk for us to jump in and shoot an untested camera, but it looked great and it felt good. And I knew that light iron sort of, had our back in a way to help us if there's any issues, and I, of course, was stressing the camera more than they wanted me to. I mean, I think that it was designed to shoot at 800 or 1600 at the time. 800, right. And I was like, but I want to shoot it all at 3200 ISO. And I don't know if you know what that means, but it's like it's stressing the camera in a way that everyone was freaking out about because it was their brand new camera. But I tried to shoot it normally and then add grain and post, and all this stuff just wasn't looking as good as it was to sort of stress this camera in a way, to me. And we ended up going for it. But again, I don't think I would have done it had I not had light iron to sort of help me feel safe in that experience. But I also added grain in post. It's like I kind of have a couple of different layers of additive things that I do to sort of induce this as much of an analog quality as possible. And I think that my threshold for a clean image is, or for I guess a dirty image is maybe lower than most. I like a mess. I like imperfections. I like stuff to fall apart. I don't necessarily need lenses to be perfect. I'm not one of those people that likes edge-to-edge sharpness. I mean, it's just a taste. It's just what I like, I guess, and that's what I like for this movie specifically. So I think what this camera really helped me do is there's like a modular aspect to it. You really can kind of design it to be what you want it to be, which I sort of figured out early on, and I was using a large format for something that wasn't something that had a lot of scope. I mean, we had such a limited field of view with what we could afford to even dress outside. Part of the reason I wanted to use shallow depth of field was to hide Prius taxi cabs driving in the background and stuff like that, which we were, for the most part, able to do because of the shallow depth of field. But I do like that this camera, if you want the opposite effect of it, you can. I mean, I ended up shooting a pilot with the same system last year, and we went for the opposite. We went for grandness and for scope and for big, giant, wide shots, and it served that perfectly as well. There's something very, you can kind of curate it to be exactly what you want it to be, which is what we went through on Can You Ever Forgive Me? And I guess all of that whole process ended up becoming the look of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting things about Can You Ever Forgive Me is you get a great feeling from doing large format on a sort of intimate story. And Dan, that kind of leads me to a question for you, which is, what are the arguments in favor of shooting large format on these kinds of stories, or on any kind of stories? What do you feel are the sort of strongest arguments in favor of large format right now?
Largely, the discussion about large format is both scientific and philosophical. In Brandon's case, talking about the lenses having something closer equating to his eye is largely true. For multiple decades, we've been kind of bound by the area given by 4 perfs of field of motion, and the rules governing the way we design lenses followed that. And now that we've gone to larger format, When we have a larger imager, we have more points more magnification. We can stretch and pull the lenses to give you a more varied look. Now, this is really important if you consider, for instance, when Brandon's show was shot, and now we'll call this a banner year. More shows are going to be seen on portable devices than any other type of device. Now that we're using a portable device, we're using a different part of our vision. We're using our center part of our vision. When we go to a theater, we used to use our peripheral vision. Our peripheral vision was largely black and white and was motion activated, so that we were engaged constantly by motion. It would redirect us as an orienting response. Now that we're looking at these smaller monitors, we're finding that we're using our color vision and our central vision, which is basically an identification system. Our color vision and our central vision, its main job is to identify differences between faces. So it can identify the difference between your friend and a stranger in the street. Where our peripheral vision, which we used to use traditionally, is what stimulates us to keep us focused on what we're watching. So with this, knowing that we have more mobility in the central vision, we're finding that we can get away by allowing for more flares. We can allow for lenses to be less mathematically perfect, because when we do that, we induce field curvature, we induce astigmatism. And what this does, gives the simulation to our central vision that we're looking at our peripheral vision. So it re-engages us. Our peripheral vision is in competition now with our central vision. So if someone, while you're watching your movie on a portable phone, someone moves on the side, we're gonna get drawn away because our peripheral vision, which is motion activated, is going to take over our visual. We're going to have to look and disengage from that movie. So we found, for instance, in Brandon, by creating effects that are novel, such as flares, softness, astigmatism, we're actually forcing your brain to analyze the picture and keep you focused on that screen psychologically. Is a psychological advantage. Another thing, too, what Brandon was talking about is with large format, we now have the ability to give you a wider array of looks, from a mathematically perfect lens, which can give you some people would call it very thin, where the image looks like it's on the screen, to something that's been more aberrated, where we actually induce depth markers. Fully, I didn't think it's more three-dimensional, and the object now looks like it's in the screen. So it becomes more immersive, more novel, and you tend to want to look at it. A really good example is if you think about the class of optics that consume the world nowadays, the optics that are used for motion picture and entertainment are 1% of 1% of all the optics built. The majority of optics are, for instance, machine vision, where their main job is to reproduce that barcode as perfectly as possible. In the case of motion picture, it's a really unique class of optics. Our job is, how do we make a two-dimensional image look or appear to have the quality of three-dimension? And on top of that, on a small screen, how can we make it immersive enough, once it goes down the streaming content and through all the compression artifacts, have a look that's identifiably different and unique, so that that target tenant or audience can recognize that show as being different, or have a quality that they remember in their head as being something they want to watch over and over again, because it doesn't look like everything else. So with that, the custom optics there, we're doing tricks. For instance, on Brandon Trost show, taught me a lot, that when he kept telling us to push the image down further and further, we were sending the lenses. We got to a threshold point when we send them the lens, we thought, oh my gosh, he's going to hate us. He's going to go to a different rental house, because they were really literally on the test bench. So aberrated and so mathematically away from the original inspiration, we thought this is going to fall apart. What I forgot about is the ultimate judge of how image looks is not a computer, it's not a test bench, it's how our brain and our eye sees. And our brain and eye is a really unique combination. The most prudent information I ever had was your eye look, but your brain it sees. If you think about it, our eye is picking up a bunch of images. It's not our eye relays an image to a little man inside your head telling you what it looks like. Your eye is taking up an image, turning into little elements of random colors, reassembling it. And you have to remember the eye anatomically is not very sophisticated. There's actually birds. Octopus have much more sophisticated vision than we do. It's our brain that separates us, that gives us the ability to recognize the differences between faces. The fact that we see black and white colors simultaneously, but they have about as much in common with each other as the sight of the sense of smell and taste. They're completely two different processes of the brain, and they do two completely different things. The black and white vision tells us spatial orientation. Color recognizes difference in faces. So when I finally realized, when Brandon kept pulling it down, what he was doing was he was finding a lens that wasn't scientifically perfect. He was looking for a lens that fit his need, that in his brain and eye combination gave him the look that he wanted. And that was not necessarily a mathematically perfect lens, because we're not making lenses, and we're not trying to sell movies that show you the best representation of a barcode. And in that case, we started inducing field curvature that gave the illusion of depth. Our eyes, if you think about it, when you leave, you only have one central part of really good clarity. Everything else is blurred images. But because your brain is constantly scanning and telling you what your reality is, we accept those blurs. So subconsciously, if we add the blurs to the lens, it gives the illusion of more depth. It gives it a characteristic that stands out from the next show. And that's partly what we did with Brandon's shows. We added a lot of structural aberrations that gave the lenses a much more aberrated look. And had that not been done on large format, we would have never gotten the latitude to push the lenses, because if this was a traditional 35 millimeter camera, the effects that we applied to the lenses would have blown up and it would just look like mush.
Yeah.
But the fact that we had such a large imager with a large magnification, it actually held up. Now the other key thing which Brandon hit on is, if you take the eyeball and unfold it, the sensor size becomes very close to the sensor size of the large format sensors, the new class of sensors. So the way the perspective distortion, the way that we see faces is very natural to us. The depth of field fall off is very natural to us. Everything starts falling in place. So the more that something looks how we perceive it, the less we're analyzing is why doesn't this look right, and the more we can enjoy the show and let the story actually take command instead of trying to analyze why this doesn't look right. A good example is if you take a picture with your iPhone. You look at the picture and says, I got it, but the perspective's off. I know that that building's not 5 miles away. It's actually much closer. And in large format, we get closer and closer to how we actually visualize things. Psychologically, our brain's not analyzing it, and it allows their target audience to enjoy the show and really realize the content more, and plus the fact that we can pull the lenses. When we take it downstream, the compression artifacts actually get trumped by the fact that the lenses have a look that actually survives the imaging chain and gives it a very unique signature.
If I can add on to that, is like, I think because you're using that 8K, the full format of it, the roundness that you talked about, Brandon, is so important, because it, a lot of people get scared about the compression and about how much it's going to take and how much storage you need, especially when you talk to, when you're trying to deal within a budget. But the idea of that roundness and that curve allows for such a natural look. And we're not telling story, like you said, the barcode analogy is perfect, because I don't want to tell a story about a barcode. I'm trying to tell a story about people, and that's when we're there in the middle of it all, that's what you need. You want to feel that emotion. And you greased the wheels for me on that one, because I actually came to Dan right after you and was talking about this pilot I was getting ready to do, and he mentioned the lenses he was sending your way, so I was like very excited about getting to use those. so yeah, it's very important to, I think, to not be afraid of that new technology, because a lot of people are, because it seems so big and so different, but it's a very simple process and a very simple thing that can make our stories, like, I think, more real.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, Matt, a little bit about your experiences, because I know you also have shot on the DXL2 and with large format lenses on a couple of projects recently, and you were telling me beforehand, how exciting it was, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with it, and maybe elaborate a little bit upon how it does make it more efficient. And because I think you're right, I think some people, they hear large format or they hear new technology and they see dollar signs and worry a little bit about that.
Well, for us, I did this pilot for HBO called Run, and it's a lot of it takes place in a train car, and so we had practical train car, we had a set built with green screen, we had also used 4K televisions as some of our exterior shots, put it flat against the window. This really great technology where we attached we had two, they call them lighthouses, at either end of the train car, attached a ball to the top of the camera, and then so as we moved handheld, we moved the perspective shift on the outside would go along with the camera. So you'd looking at, like, literally you could go up to this TV and look around the left side of it, and you could see the train curve as it's going around from the stuff we shot before, which is very cool. That being said, sometimes we knew it was going to look not real. And so one of the things we wanted to do was have this shallow depth of field, which these lenses allow for a broader field of view with a shallower depth of field, which would allow us to play with the green screen and play with the special visual effects and so forth, and do it in camera as opposed to sitting to a house later for a lot of it. And I think that's I think it ultimately helped the production with monetarily to be able to do that. And one of the biggest questions was the size of the form with the 8K. How much is that going to change everything? And once again, I was able to take stuff through Dan and talk to him about it and get them in touch with Dan to talk about it. So, and then I did some tests with light iron and so forth. And it was a very once I was able to talk to him about the process and how it's similar to every process we have right now for storage and for post and for all that stuff. It was sort of like a no-brainer. So it was pretty great.
Well, I want to move on to Late Night and have you talk a little bit about your work with Sean and Dan on that movie. So before I do that, though, let's take a look at the trailer so that everybody, if they haven't seen it, it just opened yesterday, so they can get a look and see what we're talking about here. So let's look at the Late Night trailer. Okay, so obviously just a scene from the movie, not the trailer. But I know, Matt, that on this movie you were involved, like actually way before there was even official prep. So you had a lot of time to think about the different looks you wanted for the movie. And I'm curious what some of those looks were, and how early did you bring Sean into the process, and the two of you start discussing how you were going to achieve those looks?
Well, I've known Nisha for 20 years or so.
Director.
The director Nisha Ganatra. Known her for 20 years. We went to school together, and so it was great to be able to work with her again. So we talked about it we did a pilot, and then while we were doing the pilot, we were talking about other things, and the script came up, and so we started talking about that long before, from talking about photographers like William Eggleston and Philip Dorca de Corsia, and talking about paintings and talking about films. I did a lot of prep work just talking about stuff. So as the ball rolled on, I knew we were not going to have it was a low budget movie, like 13 million, I think, or something like that. And so I knew we weren't going to have a lot of prep time on the ground, because when you get into one of those situations, the director's pulled one way and you're left like trying to find time to talk to them. So what I did was we talked about the look right on. We took some footage actually from the pilot we shot, and I came into Light Iron here in LA with Corinne Bogdanovich and sat down, and we sort of established an idea of the look. So we had we knew we wanted to go, and Sean and I got to expand on that later with, we wanted a little grain, we wanted to add some like blue in the shadows, the highlights, details, all that kind of stuff, which really, really, really helped out when we got to prep in New York. And then once we established, but none of that is all that's trial and error when you start it, because you don't know until you get there in the space with the lenses and the actual camera you're going to use. Which my camera changed 3 times the body actually changed 3 times between when we started talking about it to when I got to do the movie, because of budget shifts and so forth. At one point I really wanted to shoot a DXL, and there were all these other things that were happening, and then finally they were like, well, we don't have a budget for rigging crew, or we don't have a budget for this. And it was like, oh my God, okay. So how are we gonna move 3 times in a day and do all this? So we sort of trimmed everything down, way down. I went with the Varicam 35 because of the 5,000 ISO on it. Which provides a great base and allows you to do stuff. You still have to light it, but at least you have a base to start from, and you can do it with minor things. Then I went back to Light Iron at that point and was like, I need to see some footage of some other stuff that's been shot on Varicam. And they gave me a trailer they had, and Sean and I started talking about what we could do, which allowed me to be free and open on the set and to be able to do things with, like, most of the time, our largest light on that show was a 4K. And a lot of it was natural lighting. We had practicals lit everything we had 2 China balls in the party scene. That was it. Everything else was on the ground. So it's, I think one of the things, by having that prep and by knowing what Nisha wanted and talking about this early on and establishing, like you talked about, with establishing different look for different things and then changing it last minute, because you really do have to roll with it. And this is one of those moments. So And we were fortunate enough to have Emma and Mindy in the screen too, so that sort of glosses over a lot of mistakes. But I'm really happy with what we got to do, and Sean was instrumental in that. So
Yeah, so I had met Matt during the prep here in New York. He first started with my colleague in LA, Corinne, and he had Corinne had sent me some stills and the LUT that they had built. And so then I sat down with him through their hair and makeup tests, and that's where sort of manipulated the LUT they had built on previous footage specific to Vericam, and then sort of helped him oversee dailies and get stills every night kind of thing. And then we just communicate throughout the entire process.
yeah, it's interesting because the hair and makeup test is crucial at that point for a cinematographer, because once you get on set, there's certain things, like especially with if you have certain actors wants to look, you need to look a certain way. A certain actor, you need him to look a certain way. You can take the time in that prep to do that, and then you don't have to take the time on set, which you only have like 5 people standing around when you're testing. You have the entire unit standing around when you're shooting. So it's crucial, and to be able to sit with Sean ahead of time to actually develop some of those looks. And, they're going to change once you get in there, the looks are, because, it's an organic process, and you're trying to find things, and you're working with the actors, you're working with the director, and maybe it's sunny that day, maybe it's not. Those are the kind of things you have to deal with. It's practical, very practical, but to have that base right off the bat,
Yeah.
it was really good.
Yeah, and one of the other things that it allowed me to do too is to have the foresight that this project, when Film Nation came to us for their deliverable spec, they wanted their P3 theatrical version, but they also had an HDR version thrown on the back end that they wanted. And had we not sort of communicated early on, then I wouldn't have had the time in that while they were shooting and while they were cutting to sort of build those tools to be able to deliver pretty quickly within our color time. That I was able to color the P3 theatrical with Matt, in a week and a half or so time. And then the next day he came back and we were looking at the HDR version the next day. So I was able to change out all the LUTs and have that pre-built prior to us working together.
And, the thing about the HDR too is like I was a little nervous about it. I've done it on bigger movies, but we took like a week and a half to manipulate everything, because it really changed the way you look at stuff. Because if you're watching on standard television now, or standard HD television, you're accustomed to that feel, right? And then you suddenly step into an HDR suite or an HDR, or just a HDR television, and it literally hurts your eyes. I mean, literally, the whites can just like go, it's like just blind you. And I, as a DP, I try to deal in subtlety. It's not very subtle when you step in there, right? Well, you can't just plug this stuff in. So with what, and one of the things I was concerned about was what Dan talked about with the lenses, and because I think, as Brandon said, we all try right now. We try to break these things down, right? Because everything's too perfect. It's like if you go with you, we're a species that sees round, and this is an element that sees squares, and so we're trying to constantly break down something like that. So taking it to a more exponential level with HDR I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And so I was concerned about using these older lenses, and are the aberrations going to be the same? Aberrations going to be the same, or is what's going to happen? Like, we had this 20 millimeter lens that one of the things Dan did, first of all, he emptied out the freaking closet for me, literally. And because I tested old Baltars, these like great old lenses from 60s and 70s, Rochester, New York, right? Bausch and Lomb.
Yeah.
And then to the Zeisses, and I used the ultra speed and super speeds, the Cooks. All these things have different looks to them, and there's this great 20 millimeter, I think it was an ultra speed, I don't know what was up with it, but the right side just sort of floated off. And so I knew we were going to have these really nice, like, big shots out in New York, and everything's very linear, right? And so to try and create an organic sense of that, so the left side of the frame is like sharp and just straight on, and then it goes, just sort of drifts into something, which is it's a certain point where they find out that, spoiler alert, when they find out that Emma has done something, or Catherine has done something wrong, and they all come back together. It was like, that was a way to tell the story with that, and I was concerned about the HDR pass for that. Is that going to like take that away? And with what we were able to do, Dan assured me that we would still be there. It was just a matter of making it work for my eyes at that point. So
What's really interesting about HDR is it kind of caught me off guard, but back to the psychology and anatomically how we're programmed to pick up on lights as a survival guide is HDR is a luminance change. We're already using part of the vision that's not necessarily programmed to accept it. So when we use the HDR, we have gains, it automatically reprograms our brain. It does a self-calibration as it is, but when we take advantage of the HDR, it actually creates luminance that forces the audience to be focused back on the image. And a lot of what we're noticing, the technologies of the later or the older lenses are very amenable to the HDR process because they allow for the glares, which give the impression of a wrap. So again, once you put a wrap around someone, it makes a difference of a image looking like it was from an NFL football game where everything's flat and in focus to enveloping the object and pulling them in the screen and makes it immersive. So when you use a gain that's higher than your eye sees, our brain's going to recalibrate to the HDR and with the help of post-production of tuning it down. Because remember, HDR, you're given a 5-gallon bucket of luminance. You don't have to fill it to the top. But if you play on the top edge of that bucket to create a luminance change, you're forcing your audience to re-engage and look at the show. So you're more likely to successfully keep your audience enticed in the show. And it's really interesting how much psychology is involved. So much so, for instance, 10 years ago, we were accepting of a cut that was every 6 seconds. Now it's every 4 seconds. So much so that the psychology that cinematography has influenced on the Western civilization, as if you try watching a movie from the 80s that used to be, say, your favorite movie, I'm just aged myself, you'll find that movie seems very boring. As an example, I was trying to watch Patton, which was a great movie, and I was like, oh my God, this thing is really slow. What was I thinking? That was a great movie. And it says, I got to watch John Wick because like, bam, 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 bam. It's just, but that's the effect of HDR, of all these technologies of starting with a lens that's not necessarily mathematically perfect, but has these intrinsic optical qualities that kind of associate with our eyes. Take advantage of these post-production tools that actually augment the ability to draw our audience. I mean, realistically, we're probably really making a bunch of robot kids that can't sit still or read a book anymore, but they are going to watch your show with all these new technology. It's kind of crazy. I mean, wow.
That's all that matters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, I better stop. Okay.
That's for another panel.
Yeah.
Now, Brandon, you did an HDR finish on Can You Ever Forgive Me as well, right?
I mean, if they did, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
I've had that happen to a couple of shoots I've done. I mean, from my perspective, it always just kind of at least the colorist that I've done it with will go and do the HDR version of it, and I always just try to have them kind of squeeze it to look as close to the original and let it just play in that sort of luminance range where it's just brighter in the lights and darker in the darks. I mean, it makes it harder to hide a light out a window sometimes. Every once in a while, it's like, oh yeah, I lit this a certain way where that window's going to blow out or whatever, and it gets an HDR, and it's like you can just see all of your everything. It's like, oh man. So you have to, if you know you're going to finish that way, you have to consider it. At least that's the biggest thing I've learned.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah,
Yeah.
I set up a light right outside a window to create a sun effect, and then I saw the stand
Right.
and the freaking thing. I was like, oops.
Well, I wanted to circle back a little bit, Brandon, to your collaboration. We don't have your colorist here, but you mentioned that Light Iron really kind of had your back, and I'm curious, how early in the process on Can You Ever Forgive Me were you having discussions with the colorist about the look, and talk a little bit about how that relationship evolved and benefited the movie?
For us, it actually wasn't a lot of time. I mean, like I said, we were going to shoot completely, like it was going to be Alexa anamorphic. Like that was what we had decided. And then I think it was literally a couple of weeks maybe before shooting the movie, we decided to switch to those lenses and into that camera. So I didn't really have much of a chance to even dive in on like a look. I mean, to be honest, this was the DXL1. It was the first DXL, and there was a light iron look that had sort of been like, that was part of what was attractive about the camera, was the grade that was sort of installed in the camera just as a base level. And to be honest, I just rolled with it. I just used the light iron look as my basic go-to, and just lit everything to that, and then everything just sort of fell into place for us in the room later. But that's also something that I'll do. I mean, I'll set one look and then not touch it for the whole movie and just light to it. So by the time we get into the grade, it's just fast. Everything works. Everything has a continuity to it that if you want to make a global change, you can just apply it and you know what it's going to do. But I knew that the contrast level that I was getting out of that LUT was close to what we're after. The colors were close. It was all like reactive in this way where we had to jump in and do it fast. And even in terms of us designing those lenses in that process, I think I kept hammering you guys down the lenses, and if we had more time, I would have pushed you even more.
Right. Yeah.
But they look fantastic. But it's so I guess to answer the question is like I had just the opposite of that. Whereas I didn't have a lot of time to do it, I kind of just had to jump in with instinct and hope that it would sort of work out for the best because I thought it would. I don't know. I just try to paint myself into a good corner on a lot of these jobs, and you sort of learn along the way and make adjustments for stuff that works or doesn't work, and then it's really just for me. It's very much more being instinctual and kind of reacting to something that you see and can touch in a way than sort of over designing something at the same time. It's like you'll pick out, for me, I'll pick out kind of an idea where we want to go, but then sort of let that just be like a rule set in the back of my mind and try not to get in the way of myself or the story, if that makes sense. It's really just, for me, it's all about telling the story with the director, and you can do that with almost any tool when it comes down to it, and shape it to make it work. It's just trying to stay up on all these options and
Right.
ideas and stuff that it's like we could have designed these lenses and can still design these lenses like 100 different ways, more than that, and you just have to figure out what works for you. And in that case, we would have done even more.
Right.
But
I think Brandon
Yeah.
really points out in a really nice way is that we're in a new era where with this large format, now that we can tie it together with post-production, we can set down a certain tempo of a look. It's kind of like in the 35 world where we just basically had a chemical process. You had watercolors and acrylic, and now we have watercolors, acrylic, oil, different types of format. We have different ways of manipulating image. We can now give you impressionistic and give a Renaissance type of look. We can give you pointillist with all these different processes. And what I didn't realize with Brandon, when he kept telling us to push the lenses, is like, "Ooh, this is going to blow up, this is going to blow up." And he says, "No, we need more." And then it finally, like we said earlier, it really comes down, there's this visceral, organic tempo that we're willing to accept, and we can push it. And with large format and all the post tools, we can push it further than we had and create these really identifiably different markers that survive. And if it weren't for Brandon and the likes of Matt Clark, they're just constantly testing us. We're finding that we've just barely breached what technology is capable of, making it without having to redesign the whole wheel. A lot of this evolutionary process was always there. And again, it's regulated by how our eye and brain sees. And these technologies that we're seeing are actually making a re-loop back to what was around since the 1960s and even the 1800s. I mean, Brandon was saying he was just using a Petzval lens in his last show. This was a design that was around since the 1800s. But it's very germane by today's standard because of the technologies and the ability to manipulate images. So we're finding that had I tried putting a Petzval in a 35 millimeter format, it would have blown up in my face and I probably wouldn't be speaking here. But with large format, we have these opportunities. So I think the opportunities to create a craft that the tenant audience is going to see is greater than ever, especially if you incorporate the new technologies of post HDR and these new sensors. And the cinematographers, thank goodness, are constantly pushing us in levels that I would have never even tried.
Well, in terms of finding the right tool to tell the story, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about all the possibilities there are with lenses. And so, Dan, Matt comes to you and basically starts going through Panavision's closet, and you're pulling out all kinds of lenses. Brandon comes and you're using whatever is the most cutting edge technology. What kind of factors are going through your mind when you have these discussions with cinematographers in terms of figuring out what the right approach is, whether to be using the older technology, the newer technology? I mean, what are those? What are the factors that go into those decisions?
The main thing is like Matt and Brandon said, is that we want to basically, since we're looking at a smaller field more times than not, we want to really concentrate what the audience sees. That means less depth of field. In the 35 world, in order to get the depth of field that you can achieve in large format, we'd have to build lenses that are T.5, which are almost mathematically impossible. But now in the large format, I can give them the same amount of depth of field with a T14, which is very manageable to build. The other thing is with digital cameras, unlike film, photo emulsion, because of the colors are lateral and not longitudinal, we're gonna add a little more aberrations to kind of blend the colors to give it a much more natural look. We know that, for instance, what everyone they like is they want to avoid the effect of looking like I cut out an image with scissors and stuck it to the screen. And that's going to take some aberration, and I want to do it with a component of color. So I'll look at the clouds, I'll think, okay, this camera is probably going to absorb some of the blue light. Let's give them glass types, which a lot of the older glass, which use lead and barium, to allow more blue, where a lot of the modern lenses are using lead-free. They're trying to be eco-friendly, but the older lead stuff, which barium, and I'm convinced that's why I have all girls for daughters, because I used to carry the elements and they're slightly radioactive. Those actually allow the blue channels to go through, give you a much organic look, and that's the type of thing. So when Matt was saying, I got to break down these monitors, I got to break down the pixels, right away we went to a lot of thoriated glass. It is an isotope, might be a little radioactive, but it's not bad, don't worry, there's no Geiger
Already had
counters
my
around,
kids
but it gave us this really smoothness. And in the case of Brandon, we used glass choices with the DXL. We tried to allow for more blue channel. We knew lenses that gave us more chroma that actually caused the blending between edges. So it's really a great association with the DP asking, is it a vintage piece? So the first thing I'll look for is the timeline. When is this piece taking place? Because psychologically, a black and white and sepia, we've instilled in our audience that black and white and sepia must be vintage. If I have really strong, vibrant colors, that's more modern. And that's the first thing. I'll go for timeline. Then we ask for content. A lot of close focus. It can be a lot of wide vistas. Do you want the vistas to fall off? Do you want to have less depth of field? And that kind of builds up, okay, it's going to be a double Gauss design, which is symmetrical, or inverted telephoto, which is non-symmetrical. It gives us all these really cool fall off on the edges. It gives it, when it goes out of focus, it almost looks like impressionistic, where your tree leaves start to fall off kind of randomly. And then we start going to the nuances of how soft do you want the image. Because there's 5 things that your typical audience will see, what I've noticed, is spherical aberration, the quality of softness. Your bokeh, what's out of focus is just important to what's in focus. So how do we control the out of focus cues? How harshly? Your flares, those really pretty little dots that show up, the blue line flares like your Star Trek movies, but more importantly, your rim flares, those circles, or the little rainbow flares that come in, and then glare, that wrapping quality. So a good example is glare is like when you're looking into a headlight and just things kind of milk out. That actually wraps around the object and creates a spatial where it pulls the object into the monitor or the screen. And the last one's color. I've given up on color. Color is really the province of Sean. I mean, that's I can control color like plus or minus 50 points. Sean can control it with half a point. And the cinematographer, and that color, for instance, I forgot who said they wanted to add blue to the shadows. That really psychologically adds a strong effect. If you think of, I think it's Monet with the haystack, where he actually made the shadows on the haystack in the snow, had a fake color. It was novel. It caught our brain's attention. It was a classic piece of art. And that's very similar. By manipulating things that are not true to nature, we're creating kind of this, I guess, a version of a fantasy out of it that really draws us into the show. So those are kind of the factors we look at with the lenses.
Well, Sean and Matt, I wanted to go back to HDR for a second and late night and ask, when you moved into doing the HDR pass, how did you use that creatively to tell the story, if you know what I mean? I mean, were there things you sort of took advantage of there to better emphasize the effect you were trying to get across?
I think one of the things was because I didn't really, I didn't really think about it before we went into shooting, because, so like Brandon said, I usually go with one LUT and try and light to that, and so once I get that established, that's what I think about. And you sort of, as you get on set and you roll with things and things happen, and the story develops a different way or evolves into something, it was one of those things where you just sort of like, I tried to stick with that and do my job lighting and do my job, with the camera and stuff. And so I didn't really think about the HDR beforehand. And so when we went in, it was, for me this time, I mean, in the future, probably I'll do it a little differently, but this time it was more about like trying to maintain what I'd already done and to make sure that like when I wanted the windows to blow out, they were blown out. You know, it's like at one point we were 15 floors up and I'm seeing like a person in a red dress walk across the street.
Yeah.
Right behind, everything else in the room is white. And this person outside is red walking across the street. I was like, oh my God, what do we do there?
Yeah.
And so Sean jumped in and
Yeah, I
like,
think so. We had spent like 6 days or so together grading in a theater, just like this in a dark room, grading to 30-foot Lamberts or something, or not foot Lamberts, nits. And then when we went to 1,000 nits, it's very different experience. We're on a television, it's coming right into our eyes versus reflecting off a screen, and so as you saw in that clip, a lot of sort of late night happens in these conference rooms that are New York City skyscrapers, and all of a sudden the outside streets in New York City were alive in a way that they weren't in our theatrical grade. So we had to sort of figure out a curve that would bring down the highlights of those outside those windows and flatten the contrast out there, but wouldn't affect the sort of the specular highlights within our room. And so most of after the technical process of getting it into HDR, most of our creative process was sort of doing steps like that to sort of flatten that contrast outside those windows.
Yeah. And then we had we developed sort of 3 ideas for looks in the different parts of the movie. There was Catherine's house was sort of very warm and elegant. The studio was very neutral. And then the office was what you saw. It was a little like cooler tones, more corporate looking. And so the one thing that the HDR did for her house, Catherine's house, was the low levels. We were able to play with the low levels a little more, not necessarily for detail, but just for the feel, the roll off, and we were able to play with that a little bit. But most of it was, like you said, it was like trying to make. I think if once whoever decides to sell all the TVs and decides they're all going to be HDR now, we all have to buy HDR TVs, then I'll start planning for that. But but until that point, it's like
it reminds me of there's a specific scene in Catherine's sort of living room, which is very golden graded in the SDR version, the P3 version. And then when we went to HDR, one thing that does look very odd is if you have like a color wash over HDR, because your highlights are so bright, if they're yellow, it just looks very dirty. Where it works in SDR, but it doesn't work in HDR. So we had to figure out how to roll that, so that our peak highlights were still white, but we still kept that warmth in the room that we wanted.
Yeah. The last question I have before I open up to the audience has to do with the name of this panel, which is New Technology Balancing Creativity and Cost. So I'm curious, Matt and Brandon, from your points of view, what are the both sort of economic and aesthetic advantages of working in a way, with a place like Panavision, Light Iron, where you've got everybody from, Dan on the lens end to Sean, in the color, and, sort of working with you throughout the process? I know it's a big question.
It's a big question.
Yeah. I mean, financially speaking, we're usually a little bit out of the loop.
Yeah. I get told no.
Until it's a problem, and then we know about it a lot. But, I do know that going through just the whole camera process and through dailies and then through post, all sort of within the same family, from what I've been told, has been helpful in terms of, from a financial point of view, everyone's working together, and you can kind of get sort of one sort of fee for the whole package, or you can get like a better deal for the post if you go for the rental. That's all stuff that can be figured out. But I like the with newer technology, I just like that you can really get in and play with it in a way where you can design exactly what you want to get. It's there's so many different. The only it's getting to the point where the only limitation is really what you're asking of it. It's like you can kind of push things in any direction that you want to go. It's like just as much as I wanted to make this, Can't Never Forgive Me super soft and kind of muted and sort of beat it down. We could have gone with the same exact system, with the same exact lenses, as sharp as like a pristine, crystal clear sci-fi movie. We could have done that with the same stuff. It's just kind of what you want to pull out of it. And I don't know, but I've always been a fan of maybe just digital in general for that. I don't know. I was a digital convert early on too. So I
clawed my way in. I was like, no.
I mean, it's like I learned with both, but it's like
Yeah.
even when digital came out, I spent so much time trying to find ways to make it look more just traditionally cinematic at the time and more analog, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's just easier and easier the more that the stuff advances, and now we can play with that nuance.
Yeah. Well, I think that with working with Dan and working with Light Iron, it's like and Sean and Corinne, it's like to me that's like what you're saying is there's when you're trying to tell your story, there's so many different ways you can do it, and one of the reasons you're hired as the DP is to work with the director to find those moments, to find that moment, right? And so to be able to go to Dan and say, okay, this is what I need. What do you have? There's not many places that can do that because a lot of places have, in my experience, a lot of places they have their set lineup of things that they have, and then you have to, there's not that kind of knowledge there and then to back it up to be able, let's run this by Light Iron now, and let's see what we can do there. That's been the great thing for me as far as that. But you're right, the financial thing, I don't. Other than knowing that sometimes I get to do it, sometimes I don't. That's all.
Exactly.
But yeah.
But I mean, speaking to that, I mean, it feels so important with this newer technology to have
Yeah.
like the end game in sight within like the same family.
Yeah.
Because if we want to test something, we can test something, then we can run it over to Light Iron and see how it looks on a big screen like right away, and get those results answered quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
And also design that with the people you're going to be working with at the end. It's like it's all. It's like your world is sort of like larger but smaller at the same time in this way where you can really figure out what you want it to do, and it's just I don't know, it's just a really helpful experience.
When you used to go sit in a timing room, and you sit and you screen your movie, and you sit with the timer, and they take out their loop, and they do the little thing, and you add the lights, you take the lights away, and so it was when it was all photochemical, there was only so far you could go until you just didn't have the image anymore, right? Now you can change everything. And so I think it's important as an artist to be able to say, this is our vision, right? This is mine and the director's vision of what this should be. And to be able to have that from beginning to end is important for me as an artist, because it can be manipulated beyond and put out into the world without your vision in it, without what you're trying to, without what you were hired for, without your heart. And I think that's what, for me, is important to be able to feel that all the way. And it's a roadmap. It's not the end. Like you said, you get on set and it's snowing and there's
change it on the DI anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that to me that's the important part, is to be able to have that kind of relationship, to be able to say that, this is I really and to get that out in the open in the beginning, is to say this is what we really want to do, and then as you go through that. If you see your yellow Prius taxi cab driving by, you got to figure out how to get rid of that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think we've got time for some audience questions, so I'm going to open it up. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we've got some people out here with microphones who can bring them to you.
Hi, I'd like to ask both DPs, how quickly could you work on location, and how much lighting did you do compared to, let's say, lighting for film?
It's sort of a relative question, because I think that for me, as film developed and evolved, and with the Kodak stocks, we're at 500 ASA was my sort of a go-to film for me, 5218, and you could push that, and so you start working with the photochemical process of pushing and so forth. So as far as the amount of lighting, it's a relative, because you could shoot on the streets of New York with 500 speed film. It's the manipulation you can do afterwards. It's the difference in the contrast. And so I don't think to me, it's not about the actual physicality of it, not of the way. It's about how to shape it and how you're shaping it with digital.
Yeah, I mean, like because we also shot with such a high ISO, making the camera so sensitive on Can You Forgive Me? I mean, it was we leaned into practical lights a lot, and it was like it's like assisting that with smaller units. So do we need not necessarily less lights? Sometimes it's smaller lights.
Yeah.
I oftentimes feel like even lighting with higher ISOs, it sometimes can even be more difficult because you're dealing with practical lights that are so bright that it's actually your reverse. It's like having to light in reverse, where you're having to adjust for like all the highlights that you have. But it does depend on just what the style of the movie is. It's like we wanted that sort of almost realism that you would get out of shooting with practical lights. It just has a kind of like a warmth sort of character to it. But I'd say with the same camera on this other pilot that I did, we actually used a LUT that was more like a film print base that had crunchier blacks, and it was just contrastier, and I had to use a lot more light. It was actually like lighting for film again, just to get that same look, and you sort of have to do that to get that look still.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
a way.
I think
You know, if you
yeah.
want that real contrast.
Yeah, that's
sort
always
of
interesting to me because the LUT that you choose, you know, if you have a scale like this and you choose a LUT and you take your image and you put it in this area,
Yeah.
you can always go down, up and down within that realm for the camera, right? And so, like you're saying, if you develop a crunchy look, then you do need a few more lights to
Right.
fit in there. But like, do you find that every time you open up the camera to like 3200 or whatever, that you're dealing with like bounce? Like
yeah.
we're talking like in this room, you'd bounce off a wall here, and it increases your stop by a half a stop or something like that. So
Yeah, and then
exposure.
also if you're outside, you're dealing with shadows. All of a sudden you've got street lights from every different direction. And you've got, like, I find that we're walking with a Steadicam with like a 12 by diffusion just to like hide the light behind the Steadicam operator. It's almost like you're lighting for daytime outside in the middle of the night with no lights.
It's so
You know?
true.
Right.
So true. And the new LED lights, the new LED street lights are the worst for that. I mean, it's better for our eyes, I suppose. I don't know. That
Yeah.
square wave, I don't know if it's going to be better for our eyes in the long run or not. But
But it's, we're lighting to a sensitivity that our own human eyes can't even see.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's, so you have to sort of relearn it in a way, but that's just sort of what we do as we
Yeah.
go. And that's part of, adapting to all this new technology and finding ways to use it to, tell
Yeah.
a story and do cool things with it.
Hi, can you guys talk about a little bit about the workflow with a VFX heavy show and how matching abnormal lenses or custom lenses that have these new creations, and is that difficult then to match to any of the cameras that are already set in Maya, or how do you get that look to match across the actual VFX shot?
I don't work in VFX, but I know heavy intensive VFX shows will sometimes map the lenses
Yeah.
pre-shooting. So they'll take them on the side, and your VFX vendor will have a supervisor there that is shooting them against their gray cards or whatever.
Yeah, they
And so
shoot
then
up
they're
against,
using
like, a
that time
chart.
to map
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a chart system, and you do every aperture, and that way it's like a recorded information that the VFX house has and can apply that to all the shots that they do ultimately.
And on very heavy visual effects shows, I'll use the Infinity Wars as an example. We work closely with the visual effects supervisors, and we cued them on some of the abnormal flaring characteristics. We kind of cued them on how the lenses are going to act when they go out of focus. So when they mapped it, because a lot of times they're going to map it on a computer model, we're going out of our way to try to give it a more mosaic or impressionistic look. So we gave them cues of shoot this type of grid to show you the characteristics. In the case of, for instance, on a show called Kong Island, we actually gave them points of during the field, the lens is going to curve forward here and fall back here. And they kind of added it to there, and they were able to mix a spherical lens through visual effects to match the anamorphic look. So we work more and more in sync with the visual effects. There's a couple shows right now that we're actually weighting the lenses as we're building the lenses for them. We're giving them constant updates of what we've done to the lens so that they're prepared for it, and it makes it that much easier for them to apply their effect.
There's a lot of shows in DI too where the visual effect will go through that process and it still just doesn't match. And so we'll build sort of flares and mess it up on purpose to try to make that visual effect match a little bit, blur edges and do that in DI as well.
All right, well, we are out of time, guys, but I want to thank Matt, Sean, Dan, and Brandon for coming out and talking with us.